Silicon Flatirons is a research center at Colorado Law School. We work with students to give them the tools they need to pursue careers in tech, law, policy, and entrepreneurship.
When I started, Silicon Flatirons was an experiment. It was me and some students putting on a few conferences without really a plan where it was going to go. My initial motivation was because I didn't believe you could have impactful policy discussions unless you brought people together across different disciplines. Silicon Flatirons Center has given me an image of what a team can look like.
And it really made Boulder into a location that was seen as on par with DC or Silicon Valley and other places around the country that are leading thought centers in the field of law and tech.
What's excited me the most is to see it grow, but not only just grow in terms of the number of people attending our different events, but growing in terms of the different areas that we have been involved in.
When a law student says, I've got a passion for understanding the intersection of technology and law, but where do I get started with that? What Flatirons provides is a position to actually go angle for a job during their second summer, where they're actually going to get to be involved directly in setting tech policy or in advocating around tech policy.
The Silicon Flatirons community is incredibly unique in how close it is and how people are willing to band together to move conversations forward.
It's one thing to be sitting in a room by yourself reading articles, and it's very much another thing to actually be sitting at a table talking to somebody about their daily experiences of trying to navigate compliance with a complex new law.
We're all a community of friends who enjoy spending time with one another.
The people we engage with through here are very much thinkers and thought leaders, so they're contributing to whether it's our strategy or our resources in really meaningful ways.
Silicon Flatirons has changed the dynamic between Colorado law and the surrounding community as well as the national community.
One of the great joys of my profession is talking to people who are really early in their careers and helping them get excited about what you're excited about.
We get the types of people in the room that everyone thinks should be talking to one another, but often are not.
I get to work with students, I get to work with attorneys, I get to work with policymakers at the intersection of all these issues.
Students are first and foremost, so everything is generally student-driven.
And it is centered around people who are wanting to engage with students.
I've seen students come into Silicon Flatirons just having a little interest in it, in year one, and by year three, they're passionate about it and they found their career.
And I think that that really helps the standing of the university more broadly, and it also attracts lots of really interesting and talented speakers.
I think what I'm excited to see happen with Silicon Flatirons in the next 5, 10, even 20 years is for it to blend continuity with change.
It's not enough to have smaller conversations anymore. The world is all connected, and Silicon Flatirons is going to reflect that global nature of the internet as we move forward into 20 years in the future.
I hope it continues to operate with the same spirit of experimentation, of adventure, of seeking out new challenges that we've done over the first 20 years.
Welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here online. My name is Vanessa Koppel. I'm the Senior Events Manager for Silicon Flatirons. I just have a couple quick housekeeping notes. We are in the Zoom webinar format this morning, which means if you're in the audience, we cannot see or hear you. It's not even an option, so don't worry. We have a Q&A function. We want your questions, so make sure to put them there. You have the option to upvote if there is a question you particularly like. Make sure to put a thumbs up. And if you're a student asking a question, we'd love it if you identify yourself as a student. We also have CLE credit available for today's session. The affidavit will be sent with the survey after this is over. CLE materials are available from the event webpage, and I'll also post an event map in the Zoom chat shortly. We also have an AirMeet hallway track experience after the panel. We hope you'll join us for a virtual social networking session. It's on a browser-based platform, very easy to use, and we want you to get to see one another and get to interact with our speakers. So I encourage you to join us there. And without any further ado, I'll hand things over to Rob and Amy.
Hi, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, or good whatever time of day it is that you're joining us from right now. Thank you so much for tuning in today for what I'm sure is going to be a really stimulating conversation on the digital divide in the era of COVID-19. Whether you're working from home, attending class, or just trying to connect with friends or stream movies more frequently nowadays, you're probably more aware of your home internet connection than ever before. So I feel like this topic probably resonates deeply with many of us. Before we begin, I want to start by acknowledging that wherever we are in the world, we are meeting on the lands of First Nations peoples. The traditional peoples of the land of Boulder are the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Ute nations. And I'd like to pay particular respects to the elders, past, present, and emerging, who lead these communities. So welcome to the inaugural Legal Code event. This is a brand new series created to combine the strengths of Silicon Flatirons with the expertise of the organizations in our community in order to inspire new and thoughtful conversations. As we continue to host our events virtually, we're going to really strongly encourage you, as Vanessa said, to take advantage of the AirMeet networking session that will take place immediately following today's panel. It's going to give you a chance to communicate more directly with one another and with the speakers and with Rob and I, as similar to an in-person experience as we're possibly able to offer you in today's environment. So make sure you take note of the link before you leave the Zoom webinar today so that you can pipe in and connect. Our co-host for today's event is CableLabs. We're really excited for this, for our inaugural event. CableLabs has been part of the Silicon Flatirons community for nearly a decade in a lot of different capacities. They're also our neighbor based up the road in Louisville, and we're honored to have Rob as a really highly valued member of our advisory board. So I'm going to turn it over to Rob to provide some further opening remarks and to introduce our keynote.
Thank you so much, Amy. Yeah, it's really been a pleasure to work with you to produce this event and the whole team of Silicon Flatirons, and to work with you on the advisory board at Silicon Flatirons as well. Now, the digital divide as a topic is, of course, incredibly timely, and it's a natural fit for a collaboration between Silicon Flatirons and CableLabs. As you mentioned, Amy, broadband is playing a crucial role in really enabling the economy to continue functioning and enabling continued social connection during the pandemic. And as part of the cable industry, we're really proud to have played an important role in that. I think what we've seen is that our networks have proven resilient, and that's really thanks to the sustained technology development and investment model of the cable industry, which is centered around the work we do at CableLabs in partnership with cable operators and technology suppliers to drive continuous improvement in connectivity. As we do that, it's really important, of course, to continuously expand the reach of connectivity to ensure that everyone is connected and no one is left on the wrong side of the digital divide. But getting there is, of course, complex and multifaceted as an issue, and so we have a great lineup of experts to help us dive in and really understand what it takes. So that'll include a panel discussion later in the program, but first we'll have a keynote from Julia McHenry of the Federal Communications Commission. Julia is Chief of the Office of Economics and Analytics, and the OEA at the FCC is really a focal point for the FCC's work on the digital divide. And in her role, Julia leads the economic analysis and FCC policymaking, leads the work in FCC auctions, which include just not only spectrum, but also auctions of subsidies to help close the digital divide. I'm sure Julia will tell us more about that. Prior to her work at the FCC, Julia was chief economist at the National Telecommunications and Information Administration of the U.S. Department of Commerce, and she's a widely recognized expert in the field of economics of the internet and telecommunications. So I would be remiss if I didn't remind everyone once again of the Q&A function of our webinar. We'll have Q&A available at the end of Julia's keynote and at the end of our panel discussion. And consistent with Silicon Flatirons tradition that I'm sure many of us are aware of, we'll try to reserve the first question for a student. So Amy, unless you have anything further to add, I think we can turn it over to Julia.
That was perfect. Thank you so much, Rob, and welcome, Julia.
Oh, Julia, I think you're on mute. Can you unmute yourself, please? There we go.
Thank you, Rob and Amy, for inviting me to talk about the digital divide today, and particularly the Commission's recent efforts to close it. So while I always like an excuse to come out to Colorado, since that is not possible these days, I really appreciate you both and everyone at Silicon Flatirons and CableLabs putting together such a great event virtually. So thank you. I do have some slides, but before I share my screen, I want to apologize. I, like everybody else, am in challenging work environments here. So I've got a 2-year-old right outside this closet. So pardon the noise if you hear it, I'm sorry. So with that, I will try to share my screen. Let's see. Okay, So logistical problem. I cannot share my screen for the slides without quitting Zoom, which I think, Amy, means I can't do that. Is that right? Oh, there they are. Perfect. Great. All right. So, so I want to start out by just framing the state of the digital divide today, and then talk some about the Commission's initiatives to ensure all Americans have access to high-speed broadband in the future. So the Commission, so I think we can go to the next slide. Here we go. The Commission refers to the digital divide as the disparity in broadband availability between rural and urban areas. I think it's important to remember, however, that adoption is an essential component to connecting all Americans. So while the Commission is kicking off phase 1 of the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund auction tomorrow to offer $16 billion in support to ensure that we bring broadband access to up to 10.25 million unserved Americans. And the Commission voted yesterday to offer up to $9 billion in support to establish a 5G fund and move forward to bring 5G access to areas not served by LTE and 5G. We're also focused on ensuring Americans have the resources to connect once they have access. Likewise, I know several of the panelists and countless other community members are also thinking hard about ensuring Americans are in a position to adopt broadband services where they have access. So let's look at where we are now. The 2020 Broadband Deployment Report, released this past April, found that about 5% of Americans lack access to high-speed internet of at least 25 megabits per second up or down 3 megabits per second up. But this disproportionately impacts rural areas, where approximately 22% of the population lack access to these speeds, and tribal areas where a little less than 28% of the population lack access. Of course, moving to lower speeds, you certainly see greater access. But, so for instance, at 10.1, you'll see 3% of the population lack access. But again, this still touches rural areas disproportionately, along with tribal areas. So it should also come as no surprise that Americans living in areas that lack access also have lower median and per capita incomes than those in areas with access. And on average, deployment is highest in census blocks with the highest median household income and the highest population density and the lowest poverty rates. That said, we are doing our best to close this, as I'll talk about soon. So if deployment data has its challenges, adoption is even more difficult to tease out. But here's what we know from the Broadband Data Report. Approximately 35% of Americans with access have not adopted high-speed fixed service, with that proportion being significantly, with adoption being significantly lower in rural and tribal areas. So whereas we have 31% non-adoption rates in urban areas, that rate is just over 40% in rural areas, that is non-urban core, as we call it. In tribal lands, we see 56% of Americans have not adopted 25/3 broadband where it's available. And again, this touches rural areas much harder. So whereas we have 44% non-adoption in the urban core of tribal areas. That non-adoption rate is over 60% in the rural areas. So that's looking at adoption from the perspective of whether you're adopting high-speed service where available. The picture looks a little bit more optimistic if we step back and look at NTIA's broadband adoption data, where if we look more holistically at what percentage of Americans are using the internet from some location, you see that by 2019, 79% of Americans over the age of 3 are using the internet somewhere. So we do see, and we see progress in those numbers in terms of adoption, but certainly that is slow. So next slide. Great. So the question is then, thinking, I guess, before we touch on the next slide, thinking about why do these gaps exist? I think access and availability are really number one. Without access, of course, people cannot get the broadband no matter how much they want it. But we can't lose sight of affordability and education remaining as major areas. So according to NTIA's data, affordability remains an issue with approximately 19% of non-adopters. And again, those are those individuals who are not using the internet anywhere. But there's still 60% of non-adopters say they do not need or understand the internet, which suggests that maybe there's some other underlying issues that are still difficult to tease out. And I should say that when you're looking at the rural versus urban divide, even when I was at NTIA, we saw about a consistent 6 to 7 percentage point divergence between rural and urban communities and adoption rates. And that was that's persisted for over 2 decades. So this is, this is clearly a persistent problem that we need to think about. And certainly it also hits other demographic groups, specific demographic groups harder. So you have, for example, for African Americans and Hispanics, had 7 percentage points less likely to use the internet, and Asian Americans were 4% less likely to use the internet than white non-Hispanics. So recognizing that adoption and access and availability are all incredibly important, let's talk about the FCC's top priorities right now. So the FCC continues to work hard to expand access through the Universal Service Fund, most notably this week, at least, by distributing broadband support through the reverse auctions, improving broadband maps so we can better identify where broadband is and is not, and reducing barriers to infrastructure. So with this, you see on the screen, I am very excited to announce that tomorrow the Commission will start bidding on phase 1 of the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund auction. RDOF is a $20.4 billion fund awarded over 10 years in 2 phases that will bring high-speed fixed broadband services to rural homes and small businesses who do not have it. RDOF will prioritize higher network speeds and lower latency, building hopefully future-proof networks. Phase 1 will target over 6 million homes and businesses in census blocks that are entirely unserved by voice and broadband, with download speeds of at least 25.3. And phase 2 will then cover locations in census blocks that are partially served and that were not covered by phase 1. So RDOF really builds on the success of CAF phase 2 auction and nearly a decade of USF high-cost programs to bring broadband deployment to Americans who do not have access to high-speed broadband. So to put this $20.4 billion in perspective, as of December 19, the Commission has authorized Universal Service Administrative Company to obligate and disperse funding for totaling approximately $1.2 billion over a 10-year term to support almost 500,000 locations in 45 states. So looking at that, this $20 billion really is an extraordinary effort and symbolizes the FCC's extraordinary commitment to expanding access in the coming 10 years. So the Commission is also focused on rural Americans, ensuring that rural Americans have the same access to 5G wireless services as their urban counterparts. So now you can go to the next slide. So just yesterday, the Commission adopted a report and order to establish the 5G Fund for Rural America. The Commission adopted a $9 billion budget over a 10-year term of support with 2 phases. Phase 1 will auction up to $8 billion with $680 million set aside for bidders serving tribal lands. Phase 2 will make at least $1 billion available to target deployment that targets facilitating the adoption of precision agriculture technologies. Support will be targeted to deploying 5G networks in areas without any unsubsidized provider of either 4G or 5G. And that will be based on our new mapping effort, the Digital Opportunity Data Collection, which I will talk about next. But before I do, let me talk about another important effort. In addition to supporting 5G, we're also ensuring that tribal areas in particular have access to the spectrum they need to deploy 5G. So, sorry about that. So on September 2nd, we closed the tribal priority window for the 2.5 gigahertz band to give tribal entities access to spectrum they can use to connect consumers living in rural tribal areas. Over the course of the window, the FCC received more than 400 applications from tribal entities throughout the country. Staff is currently reviewing those applications and they'll be requesting additional information from applicants as necessary. 2.5 is the largest contiguous band of largest contiguous band under 3 gigahertz, but it's vastly underutilized. And being mid-band spectrum, it hits that sweet spot of coverage and capacity. So once we can get this spectrum into tribal hands, we will be auctioning the remaining unassigned 2.5 gigahertz spectrum will be available to facilitate rapid deployment across America through an auction. So we're eager to put these white spaces to work. So next slide. Turning back to mapping, the Digital Opportunity Data Collection proceeding is changing how and what broadband availability is mapped by the FCC and required from fixed broadband services. The DODC will culminate in a public web-based map that shows at a granular level where fixed broadband service is available and where it is not. The map will provide data by speed, technology, provider, and business residential categories. The data on the map will be based on geospatial coverage maps submitted by fixed broadband providers, showing areas where each provider makes fixed broadband service available. So this will inform the FCC's decisions about areas of the country that will be eligible for USF broadband support, particularly coming up in the 5G auction, the 5G fund auction, as we just talked about. And it includes a crowdsourcing portal to allow all stakeholders to provide data on the accuracy of the data submitted by the providers and to tell us their experience in fact, connecting to broadband in their area. Next slide. Next slide. Great, thanks. So in addition, the FCC is focused on a number of other efforts. Infrastructure reform. The Commission focused on changes to siting to accelerate deployment to remove regulatory barriers that inhibit the deployment of infrastructure necessary for 5G and other advanced wireless services. The Commission's declaratory ruling focuses primarily on local fees and the authorization necessary to deploy small wireless facilities. I would be remiss if I also mentioned a number of the other programs, the ongoing programs that the Commission also has that are really focused on expansion of access and subsidies. And so, of course, one of those is the E-rate program, which keeps schools and libraries connected. This month, a first wave of funding was provided in the amount of 1.4 billion 1.4 million in the E-rate funding program for 291 schools, serving over 220,000 students. The FCC has also enabled hundreds of rural broadband providers to offer discounts and service upgrades for families who participate in the National Lunch Program. And of course, these days when so many of our students, including mine, are virtual, these types of programs are essential to really ensuring that we can keep all students connected as necessary. Likewise, Lifeline, it connects low-income consumers qualifying for low-income to discounted broadband when eligible. So I think these programs, again, as I said, in terms of adoption, are essential. Next slide. So turning and looking a little bit more to what the Commission has been up to with respect to COVID. I will say, you know, the chairman, I've lost my place. So the chairman has been devoted really from the very beginning to ensuring both that the Commission staff is safe, but that we are doing everything we can at the Commission to ensure Americans can remain connected during COVID. So of course that started on March 13th. The chairman announced the Keeping Americans Connected pledge, which was accepted by 785 service providers signed to ensure that they are continuing to allow Americans to stay connected and waiving fees and opening up Wi-Fi as available to ensure that Americans can stay connected through all of the struggles that they have related to COVID. Likewise, the Commission has really been engaged in an enormous effort to get $200 million of appropriated funds out the door to assist in terms with grants for healthcare providers to start offering or to support telehealth programs. And of course, these have been essential related to COVID to ensure that we're continuing to connect Americans to healthcare, even as these challenges persist and it's more and more difficult to get to your doctor. I should say, I think this is also an incredibly promising effort for the future of rural areas where we increasingly see healthcare facilities shutting down or moving further away for many people, and just being able to connect with your doctor quickly over the phone or quickly online rather than having to drive several hours to reach them will be incredibly beneficial. Next slide. So, I guess that's the end. So I should also add that the Commission has been working on any number of huge efforts to continue to keep services running throughout COVID. And I think that, well, we can talk about more in the comments. So thanks, Rob.
Thank you so much, Julia. That was a great overview of everything that you and the FCC are up to on the digital divide. We have a few minutes for questions, and I understand we do have a law student who's able to pose the first question to Julia. Alan, you could introduce yourself, ask your question.
Hi.
Thanks.
Hi, can you guys hear me? I lost Zoom on my computer, so I'm just...
We have you now. Yeah.
Can you see me okay and hear me though?
You look great.
Okay, my name's Alan. I'm a 1L this year at CU. And thank you for having this conversation today. I wanted to ask if you think that it would be useful for the FCC to start using state mapping technology to better coordinate RDOF funds, and if the FCC would ever allow states to determine where RDOF funds are awarded.
So that's a great question. I think drawing on some of the experiences I had both at the FCC and NTIA when they were managing the broadband map, when you're working with states, some states are phenomenal. I think there's some really good programs out there. And I could start singling out states, but I probably better not to. But the problem with working directly with the states is some are not. And so really, I think when it comes to federal funds, really, I think one of the places where the FCC and really any federal regulator has an advantage is to be able to direct, sort of large amounts of funding consistently across the country and treat all those states fairly. So I don't know that we'd work with states, just because our experience in the past has been that it really is a patchwork of some really good states where you know exactly where it is, and some they're just, you know, where the money is just not, they're just not directing the resources. So I don't know in terms of broadband mapping whether that's the right way to go, but certainly there are some states that are doing some really interesting things that we have noticed, and we're looking at to think more about those programs and how can we facilitate those on the federal level. Whether we'd allow the states to sort of direct the funding, again, I think states are critical in this effort. I think, you know, what we at the federal level do really well is getting this support out. You know, the states are also very necessary for filling in some of the gaps. And I should say, you know, for the FCC, we've now sort of established, particularly with the success of CAF2, that a really good way for us to get this funding out is using this reverse auction, where essentially you have carriers across the country competing for the resources all together. So, you know, it provides essentially across the country a fairly uniform way to get the funding out. There is certainly a role for the states, but I don't know that we would be relying on the states to put FCC money to use for broadband.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, it's a great question.
Thank you, Alan. And I see we have a couple questions in the chat as well, again, focused on data. One on the adoption side, question around whether the FCC is considering including adoption data in its new and improved data collection or mapping efforts to get a picture of that side of the issue. And also a question on the access side of the issue in terms of the specific numbers that the FCC has around who has access at broadband speeds, presumably 25.3, contrasting some of the numbers the FCC has with some of other numbers that other organizations have put out, such as Microsoft, which has you know, a higher number. So if you could address that as well as the adoption side, Julia.
Sure. So the adoption is certainly an interesting question. It's, you know, it is not part of what we're looking at necessarily as part of DODC, but certainly still exists in 477. And, you know, I think we will certainly continue to be looking at adoption. I gotta say, I think if identifying access is hard, identifying adoption is even harder, right? Because I think suddenly you're layering a whole nother layer of issues on top. Essentially, now they have a numerator and a denominator. So we certainly are looking at how to continue to track adoption, and you know, and we will continue to do so. But really, what we're focused on in the entire, you know, the point of the digital opportunity data collection is to ensure that we are finding the places where access is not. So I think 477 was good for adoption, right? And we kind of had good numbers around that. But it wasn't just purely based on the design. It just was not particularly good at identifying where those locations, where those little gaps are, and sometimes big gaps, where we don't have data, so, or where we don't have access. So, you know, it's not our focus right now, but certainly something we'll continue to track. And like I said, you know, it is important to understand adoption. So in terms of how our numbers differ from Microsoft's, you know, for those who don't know, our collections are based on the filings of all, you know, essentially required filings for all broadband providers and carriers to us. And so those collections are straight from the horse's mouth, and the data is as good as what we get, and then spend many months working tirelessly. We have an entire staff on my team who work really day and night to ensure that we get the highest quality data, and are constantly working directly with the carriers to ensure that. Data like, you know, I think, I don't know whether the right word to say is sort of commercial administrative data, where Microsoft is essentially pulling the metrics coming out of where they're seeing the use of their products. You know, I think there's a use for that, but in many cases that can give you false positives, right? So you don't necessarily know what's on the other end where they necessarily are. And, you know, and I think we have a number of reasons to have skepticism in terms of what that data is. So at least with respect to DODC, you know, and frankly 477, we're relying on the carriers. Whether there's room to continue to use those other data sources as confirmation or sort of some additional factors to look at in terms of making sure that we're getting it right. I think that's certainly a piece of the equation, but I think we have a lot of reasons to suggest that those numbers maybe they're looking at something a little bit different. So really, we're looking at where can you get access and where do we have subscriptions.
Okay, thanks for putting that in perspective. Appreciate it. So I think we'll need to leave it there to keep our program on track. But thank you so much, Julia, for joining us, providing your insights. Hopefully you'll be able to stick around for the panel discussion and the AIR Meet get together afterwards. And I know there are a few questions in the Q&A we haven't had a chance to get to. Maybe folks can pose those live when we get to the social hour.
Sounds great.
So with that, yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, Julia. And we'll transition to the panel now. And to do that, I'll ask the panelists to go ahead and turn on their videos and audio. And I'll just briefly introduce Rosalind Layton, who will be moderating our panel today. We're really lucky to have Rosalind with us for this. Rosalind, just by way of brief introduction, is a senior vice president with Strand Consult, which is an independent research firm focused on telecom and tech. She's a visiting researcher at Aalborg University in Denmark, regular contributor to Forbes, and we've had the pleasure of working together on the TPRC, the Telecom Policy Research Conference. So Rosalind, nice to see you again. Look forward to the discussion, and I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Rob. And let me say congratulations to Silicon Flatirons on your 20th anniversary. It is truly fabulous. And I want to congratulate all of the students in the program for choosing Silicon Flatirons. I have watched it grow over the last decade, and I never cease to be, I'm totally impressed with all of the students, how intelligent they are. The graduates go on to do so many great things. So you really have a great program and you keep making it better. So thank you for inviting me. And I had the honor to work with a great panel today. I'm going to introduce them. And I'm going to start with already a graduate of your fine program, Ediael Casaperalta. She's an alumna and is from the Telecom and Tech Law program, and herself has created a career in supporting Indigenous and underrepresented communities and telecommunications matters. She's coming to us today from Denver. We have Ernesto Falcon from the Electronic Frontier Foundation. He's a senior legal counsel. He earned his degree from the University of the Pacific. He's well recognized for his advocacy in many tech and telecom policy issues, has also a career with public knowledge. He's worked on Capitol Hill and in the California Governor's Office. I'm also pleased to introduce Brett Perkins, who's a senior vice president with Comcast. He has a distinguished career building partnerships with state and local government. During the time of his tenure, it's grown, Comcast has grown from serving 2,500 communities to over 6,000 across the USA. He has his undergraduate and graduate degrees from Temple University in Philadelphia and is now a trustee there. And finally, we have Greg Roston, who is the director of the Public Policy Program, Institute for Economic Policy Research at Stanford, where he also has earned his PhD in economics. And he's earlier an economist at the FCC. And he has many excellent topics, many excellent papers on the topics we're going to discuss today, and we'll definitely get into some of his papers. Let's turn to, I just want to thank Julia for those excellent remarks. And we should take a quick moment to recognize the FCC. Earlier this month, the Nobel Prize was awarded to two economists who've been working on FCC auctions. If you aren't familiar with that, it's really go to the Swedish Academy of Sciences. You can see an excellent discussion. The Federal Communications Commission is truly a world leader in promoting the concept of auctions. And this is from the first auctions themselves in 1994, the incentive auction in recent years. We look at now, we're using reverse auctions for the rural Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, which Julia has talked about. It's really a hotbed of experimentation and innovation, and regulators around the world study what the FCC is doing. And what I think is great through Silicon Flatirons, that students can actually learn about this firsthand. Our panelists have experienced this and worked directly with it. And so it's really a testament. Before we get into our, I want to turn this over first to the panelists. If you have any comments on Julia's remarks, I think that she's talked a lot of valuable areas. I would just offer myself what I've seen, at least with reverse auctions, is that it, in many respects, if you're offering subsidies, and if you're a private company, it might seem like free money. And if you do a reverse auction, you sort of you actually have to force the. You might say that in this case, you make the money go further, if you will. So we've seen in other reverse auctions where the FCC can cover more areas with less money because the private providers may extend further, or they economize in how they will invest. That's one observation. I'd love to turn it over to the panel if you have any thoughts on this concept of the reverse auction for the unserved areas. What are your thoughts about this model and how well it's worked so far, and your expectations for the future? Greg, maybe you want to start us off if you have a thought or two.
Yeah, so I have to start with following up on your point about the Nobel Prize winners. One's office is 50 yards behind me, and the other's is 150 yards to my left. So they're both Stanford guys, so I have to make that plug. And also,
we get the pixie dust from them. I wish we could all spread it all around in our panel, but thank you.
Yeah, and also recognizing Evan Correll at the FCC, who's been the stalwart of auctions since well before they started. And one of the things that a group of us put together a submission in 2008 advocating for reverse auctions, and included in that group and organizing it was Paul Milgram. So reverse auctions have been something that economists think are much better. As long as you define what it is you need, then trying to do it as efficiently as possible is the right answer. But the definition of what is needed is really critical, and what is wanted, and then you try and do it as efficiently as possible. So as the director of public policy, I tell people that economics is really important, but it's not everything. You have to frame the right question in order to optimize for efficiency. So this is something, there was a lot of talk in Julia's presentation about 25.3. And if everyone could do an exercise right now, which is go to the zoom.us little thing at the top of your screen and click on preferences. And you can get to settings and see statistics and see what bandwidth you're actually using for this Zoom call. I'm using just about 1 megabyte each way. So not close to 25, close to 3, but not 25. And that is sort of an interesting piece of people, depending upon what people need. How many Zoom calls do people need in a house? Some people need a lot, and other people don't. It depends on whether we're preparing for COVID times or normal times, what people need. So those are the things that a reverse auction can do, is say, if you say everyone has to have 25.3 or prioritize higher speeds, you can prioritize that. But then once you've made the decision about what people need, then you try and do it as efficiently as possible.
That's really a great point. Just as a side note, I have myself written a paper about using reverse auctions for the Relay Fund, which is an efficient way to reimburse funds for deaf communications. So there's a variety of applications. So thank you for that, Greg. What other, I think I'd like just one more follow-up question for the panel. Any thoughts on Congress's view around coming forward? We are facing election next week, in case anybody didn't know. But will we see this approach continue? Would we see anything change? Anyone have any thoughts that they'd like to share around this way?
Rosalind, can I actually mention thoughts on RDOF as well?
Of course.
That one?
Of course.
Well, first of all, thank you so much to Silicon Flatirons for inviting me to participate in this amazing conversation. I think on RDOF and specifically with reverse auction models, unfortunately, what we have seen across Indian country is that models that rely on competition work really well where there's a desire to compete for the funding and where there's a desire to be present. You know, a lot of rural, remote communities and communities that are low income and across Indian country are in remote areas that do not attract the same level of interest, even in a competitive bidding model. And so what we see the result of these competitive bidding models is that they result in very low access to internet service and quite frankly, mediocre access to internet service. And part of it is that there are no rules within these models to truly encourage the participation of tribal governments or entities that will work with tribal governments and tribal entities to deploy service in these areas. So for example, one of the challenges is that not at the short form or the long form section of RDOF, the folk that submit a bid and say, you know, we should get more points because of the tribal bidding factor or tribal bidding points. There's no requirement for the entities that could receive this funding to collaborate with the tribal governments in the region where they bid the money to ensure how do we deploy the service in your area, right? And so one of the challenges of RDOF, unfortunately, is that the entities best positioned to build broadband networks that truly connect communities and that bring the desired speeds, that bring the service that people want in the region are not really well involved in these processes. The funding mechanism is not designed for those entities. Unfortunately, you know, what we've seen with RDOF, in addition of the flood data maps that were used to determine the first phase one, is that out of, I think, the hundreds of entities that have become available to participate in the auction, I believe there's only a handful that are tribally owned companies. So, you know, a handful of participants that have a stake in building sustainable, you know, broadband networks that respond to the needs of the communities is not going to make a huge difference for the entirety of Indian country. So I think those are some of the challenges that we're seeing with competitive, you know, reverse auction models, is that the model itself does not result in prioritizing funding in the hands of people best equipped to close the digital divide in Indian country.
So, Edgel, thank you for sharing that point. And I think what you're saying is that this reverse auction may be valuable, but certainly not in every case. Just to follow up on that, because this is an area of an expertise, why don't you talk a little bit about the 2.5 gigahertz rural tribal window? I mean, there we've seen 400 bidders have come forward. Maybe you can discuss, you know, compare those two models. What is the, you know, what are the pros and cons as you see them?
Yeah, thank you so much. And that opportunity, that initiative at the FCC carries great promise. And I guess we're starting on our panel conversation with everyone. So as Julie mentioned in her remarks, the tribal priority window created an opportunity for tribes to obtain certain entities, tribal governments, entities owned by tribal governments, to obtain a license in the spectrum band that would allow them to deploy wireless networks. I want to be really clear that the 2.5 opportunity is about wireless networks, right? There's still fiber that needs to be deployed across Indian country. And I think Ernesto's organization has a great report on the lack of fiber access throughout rural communities in the US. And so what this provided was an opportunity for the entities that best know tribal lands that best know rural landscapes to hold a license that allow them to create a wireless network using this one spectrum band that is very valuable. And so in the opportunity was actually only focused, unfortunately, it was only open for tribes that are recognized by the federal government. There are 574 federally recognized tribal governments in the United States. And those were the only ones that could participate. They are not the only indigenous and tribal governments in the United States. There are also state recognized tribes across states. And then there are also indigenous peoples that are not legally tribes, even though they have a federal relationship with the US government. For example, Native Hawaiians, they are not a tribe. There is no single political group that speaks for Native Hawaiians, but yet their lands were eligible for this window. So, there were some challenges like with the tribal priority and window that certain entities were not eligible. Also, this focused on rural lands, on rural tribal lands, which means that any tribe that had land in an urban setting was not eligible to get a license over their urban lands. So this created a bifurcation of Indian country that is just fictional. Indian lands, tribal lands are both in rural and urban areas, but the FCC essentially chose rural areas only. So that was also a challenging component. The other component that was really difficult for this promise to really come to fruition in the way that it could was that the window was open. Tribes were encouraged to apply for a license. So not to submit a bid, but just apply for the license. Beginning February 3rd, ending August 3rd. That is the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic. Tribes that were eligible are federal, they're tribal governments. They now were in the midst of, ensuring that their communities had the necessary, were taken care of, right? That their hospitals were running, that their schools were not closed, how to handle schools, their businesses were having to be closed. And so this amazing opportunity was really truncated because a lot of tribal governments just had to protect their members. They were the ones responsible for ensuring the health and safety during this pandemic of their tribal residents. And so, Amarin Critical Infrastructure, our company, along with a lot of tribal advocates across the country, petitioned the FCC to extend the window for another 180 days, hopefully close in January of 2021. And we had seen the FCC, extend deadlines in other in other initiatives like E-Rate. And unfortunately, the FCC only provided 30 additional dates, even though tribal governments are still dealing with, with the challenges that the COVID pandemic represented. But the promise that is still holding out for this window as the FCC, decides which tribes are able to grant the licenses, is that now tribes are in control of how to use the airwaves over their lands to build networks. And hopefully also the FCC learned quite a lot about how to truly engage with tribal governments.
So Ediel, thank you for that. You're truly an expert in this area, and it's great to have your thoughts. I want to give our other panelists a chance to weigh in their areas of expertise as well. Let me go to Brett from Comcast, and I think, as Julia mentioned, 785 broadband providers really stepped up during the pandemic. Leader in that front has created over 1.5 million Wi-Fi hotspots, which I understand are free through the end of 2020. It has been working on a long-term project creating over 1,000 connected lift zones and community centers across the country. I also know, that Comcast has been leading through its Internet Essentials program, connecting 8 million people in 8 years. So it really has a lot of experience in this area, and has also continued to adapt its programs under COVID. So maybe you could tell us from your perspective, you've obviously experienced a lot of these challenges firsthand.
Thanks, Rosalind. And I think like everybody else, I wish that we could all be in Colorado together. I love my home city of Philadelphia, but I am dying to be somewhere else right now. So I really appreciate the chance to be with you and this incredible group of panelists. So I think we, like everybody else, we're experiencing this and are experiencing this once in a lifetime, hopefully once in a lifetime incident that has impacted us in every way. March in some ways wasn't that long ago, feels like forever ago, when we were all coming to grips with what was happening to us in our lives were going to change, and all of a sudden everybody who could was going to be working from home, and all the children were going to be, including my kids, were going to be doing their studies from home. And probably the first thing I think about during that time was just the importance of the network. Everything that we rely on here, the unsung heroes for us and really for, I think, the rest of the country, are all the engineers that have done the work to keep the network moving. And that includes increasing capacity. No surprise to everybody here that we, along with everybody else, have seen incredible amounts of change in network usage. And I think the good story for us 7 months hence has been that the networks have performed really well. For us, we had some benefits in this, and you mentioned it, Rosalind, that we've been operating Internet Essentials for the last 9 years. And so focusing on the disconnected, particularly the adoption side of it, is something that we, with really some amazing partners who have taught us a lot and helped us, kind of came into this with a running start. So out of the gate, we knew that connectivity was going to be the center of this. And so, as you mentioned, we've opened up our Wi-Fi hotspots, our public Wi-Fi hotspots, but we also offered up our Internet Essentials free for 60 days for new customers. And we doubled down and spent a ton of time with school districts. And so one of the things that we announced a little more than a month ago was the creation of something called the IEPP, the Internet Essentials Partner Program. And fortunately for us, we've been working on partnerships with districts and cities on the adoption side pre-COVID, because no surprise what happened, all of a sudden something that is a best efforts initiative for people, we've got to close the digital divide, it becomes cliche, and then all of a sudden it becomes every single child needs to be connected if they're going to be able to do their schoolwork. And there's a great part of that, which is, I think you've got everybody focused on this. I think it's a tendency to talk around it. And now it's pretty clear what the measurement stick is. And so in the IEPP, we were able to structure a way to partner with school districts and cities and foundations who came and said, look, I want to make sure that I get this school or this district connected, and can you do that in a simple way? So we established a way to do that. On the back end, really, really difficult, but before COVID, hit somewhere in the middle of it, we had about 70 of those. Now it's a couple of hundred of those kinds of agreements. And I know we'll talk about it a little bit later, but I think probably one of the best lessons that we've learned again in this is how complex this issue is. That in the face of COVID, we're dealing with everything that is the barriers to having people be fully connected. We have an access issue. And now it's you've got to solve that access issue. And then we have a really complex adoption issue. And even when you take and make it as relevant it is today, you realize that there is a litany of other barriers that are in the way of getting people connected. And I hope that we'll get a chance to talk in some more detail about those.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. I do, I want to come back to that question. I do want to get everybody have a chance to weigh in here. You did, I will go to Ernesto in just a moment, but since you did bring up education, I want to go to Greg because he has a paper looking at, I think, which is extremely timely, and I'm sure that Silicon Flatirons will post it, but looking at how schools are responding under the circumstances. He has worked with Scott Walston at Technology Policy Institute, if I'm not mistaken. And Greg, I hope you will enlighten us a little bit about your research. And I know it's extremely important and timely.
So the research that we've done so far was on looking at the impact of a low-income program, Internet Essentials. We were able to do a comparison of areas where Internet Essentials was offered and where no low-income program like it was offered in other cable territories, and seeing the impact that that had. And it has a big impact, but it doesn't solve everything. And that's one of the things that we think right now. There are 10,000 experiments going on in the United States with schools doing different things, looking at what works. So this is partly why it was great to hear Julia talk about data and the Digital Opportunity Data Collection Group. I think that's fantastic. I think they should extend it to, there's a great source for wireless coverage that is probably looking for some good PR right now, called Google. They know where every single signal goes from every signal carrier because everyone uses Google Maps. So the FCC, if it could figure out how to get that data, they would know where wireless coverage was very quickly. And this is kind of thing that is data on access, but also looking at the adoption rates between different schools, that some gave hotspots, some didn't. How beneficial was the hotspot to get people on, for example, and that kind of thing. I do have to tweak Julia a little bit, which is my good friend Reed Hunt and former boss would be, I think, smiling right now to hear Chairman Pai talking about the benefits of the E-rate program, given how anti-E-rate the Republicans were when he was trying to get it through. So this is something that's good. We need to have targeted programs and things like that. I wanted to come back to a point that Ediel made about the auctions not necessarily working. As I said, I think once you have your goals, the auctions are an efficient way to get that goal, but maybe the goal didn't say enough about tribal areas. And there should have been, we now have sort of the auctions may serve unserved areas, but maybe there's a way to say, hey, you need to serve a tribal area, and therefore there can be a special fund for tribal areas, just like the, there was a fund for precision agriculture, which I thought was kind of an interesting thing for a market-oriented Republican administration to say, we need to fund this very specific thing. But there can be, I think, better things to fund, like tribal areas, and low-income programs are really where I think we need to focus our attention. But I've been ineffective in the past. I wrote articles about low-income adoption where there used to be a fund called LinkUp. And within a month of our time writing how effective LinkUp was relative to Lifeline, the FCC canceled the LinkUp program. So I'm not sure that my policy advice gets listened to as much as I think it should.
So, well, Greg, thank you for that excellent insight. And it also it shows that I think the telecom policy is quite bipartisan, and that the ideas get recycled over time. I can certainly see myself working from abroad that the ideas get in the ether and they're tried and recycled in different ways. And it's great we can come back and talk about them. And I guess the one thing I'd say about precision agriculture, which might be interesting, certainly in the context of 5G, is that with 5G, you get the opportunity for industrial applications that might not be possible with wireline technologies, that you have to have wireless capabilities. And so the main difference with 5G as opposed to 4G, which was largely consumer, with 5G, we're trying to go to industrial platforms, enabling more actors, not just consumers. So that may be one argument. But let me go. What?
We don't have federal funds for time sprinklers or more efficient tractors. But here all of a sudden we think it's important that the 5G fund for precision agriculture be there. I'm a little skeptical.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, we can look at the data and see what it says. But I'm going to turn it now to Ernesto because he is, I think he's probably seen every telecom policy topic. I'm delighted to have to hear what he has to say. And I'm going to take a step back, Ernesto, because you have seen a lot of models in telecom policy. You know a lot about the providers, traditional providers. You know also about taxation, taxpayers model. You've worked in the different parts of government. And I will also recommend on your website, you have very detailed policy discussions on a variety of topics, and I want to commend you for that. What I'm interested in, what you have to say on what we shared so far, but also where I would say that what we're doing a lot of innovation in the models for broadband funding, but and we have traditional consumers are paying, the traditional companies are paying, but the one group that's not really involved so much would be the tech companies, California's tech companies, which are the ones who have money in these days. Consumers are cash strapped, governments are cash strapped. What do we see? What are your thoughts around bringing the tech companies to get involved in these discussions? Because they're also some of the first to be benefiting from the broadband networks.
Sure. And thank you for the question, and thank you for the invitation to speak at this panel. I think, everyone benefits, right, in the sense of the expansion of access and the more people that are connected nationally. And, we have kind of two things that are happening. So let's talk federally, and then I'll talk about the state. But, federally, there's a bill that passed the House that would essentially put a fairly large general appropriation of money, about $80 billion plus a $40 billion long-term low interest loan program, emphasizing on, high capacity future-proof networks. And, I think that given the limitations of USF and how much you actually can pull out, and RDOF is committed, right, and a fairly large amount, I think thinking about how general revenues pay for these large, big down payments is an important piece of this. And fiber infrastructure uniquely gives us this opportunity. So, what I mean by that, and the FCC, I think, is doing a really good job with RDOF's metrics of future proofing. Future proofing is a really important concept here because we have subsidized a whole lot of this infrastructure and are not really satisfied, I think, with the outcomes we have right now. COVID-19 really gives us a sneak peek of what the future of what normal internet usage would have been in the not too distant future anyway. And to the extent that it is not, and it's failing in lots of different communities for lots of different reasons, areas that have, fairly high capacity networks, haven't suffered, right? They've actually been more than able to handle the crush of new usage, of home usage, of working from home, remote education. And those networks, primarily, backed fiber, universally, a lot of fiber is going out there to give these networks the capacity. Those are going to be good for decades from now. And the thing that I think that we need to start rethinking a bit is how we do subsidies in terms of the ongoing subsidy effort. Because I do think we're stuck a little bit in a perpetual subsidy mindset, and we don't have to be, simply because now we know enough about the infrastructure where if we do this large down payment investment in the country, a national investment in the infrastructure, you won't have to come back, right? Not within our generation, not within the next generation. And I do think the general appropriations and tax and spend policy of Congress is an appropriate place, which incorporates all the companies, right? All the companies will benefit, including the large technology companies. At the same time, Adiel made a really good point, and I do think reverse auctions is the right approach, but there are some intangibles that are hard to assess, but are also extremely important. And one of them is like local, the broadband version of localism, meaning local players tend to know culturally what like the community needs and are more equipped to meet those needs in the long term, and they may not be the player that wins the reverse auction on depending on how you set up that reverse auction. I mean, Gregory's absolutely right. I mean, I think one of the tensions in the reverse auction is if you want future proofing, but you also want to try to minimize how much you put out there, you're going to run into some tension there, because future proofing actually requires a fairly large upfront investment, but the lifetime of the assets spread out over decades. So actually in the long run, I would say it's actually a better use of dollars to solve the problem for the better part of a couple generations versus solve it for 10 years, right? But I see a lot of like rural cooperatives, and I suspect it's the same in tribal governments and other players, that their knowledge of the needs on the ground are just uniquely superior to any outside company coming in to build, and figuring out, I don't have the solution to how to capture that. I just know that's just a reality, and many of the really successful, hard to serve rural models are led by a local, usually a local cooperative or some sort of local public entity. And they just have a lot of baked in experience and knowledge, having served the community for so long, of knowing kind of how to increase adoption and reach those metrics you need to actually make it self-sufficient. Related to that too is the self-sufficiency. So, and when I talk about the perpetual subsidy concern, we have spent billions right now, and I don't think we are happy with what we've gotten out of that investment. And we are slated to spend, another 20 billion. And I actually think we need to spend more, but as long as we are spending it on future proofing, right? And really like a long-term investment that's meant to be not just sufficient for today, not sufficient for tomorrow's uses, but sufficient for whatever we could possibly imagine what the capacity needs may be of a community well into the future, then we don't have to keep putting more government dollars into this infrastructure after the fact. And then that'll allow us to, I think, one, reduce how much we're spending in that way in the long run, but also have more available to target the adoption challenges, which I think are driven a lot by affordability and the Comcast, I think, deserves some praise on putting out free Wi-Fi hotspots. I actually think there is a space we have to figure out in policy of how do we create more free spaces, simply as the means of community centers and areas where people can just have free access to robust internet as the fallback. I speak to a handful of libraries that have really kind of interesting and cool ideas, and this is where E-rate's really important. They want to be able to allow people, and because they deal with a lot of particularly on the low income side, people who come in and they want to, give them access to information in terms of books, but they also want to be able to allow them to check out a free internet access account for X number of a period of time. And I think that's a great idea. I think there's so long as the infrastructure is there, if it's available, if it's open and shareable in a way that allows that type of approach from a public sector meeting the need of people who just don't have money, right? Or just don't have the means. There's lots of things that are happening, lots of experience happening under COVID-19 that I think we will learn a lot of valuable lessons and need to figure out how to implement and update a lot of our policies on that ground.
So, well, Ernesto, thank you. You really demonstrate breadth and depth of expertise there, and I'm sure many will appreciate the comments you've made about the sustainability of the funding, the need to update it. And I would say just to the students listening today, this is a really great research opportunity. If you look at policy, studying the past policies, how can it be improved? I want to make, I'm going to put a question here to Brett to follow up, but I want to make maybe one point that if we're looking at the USF funding, the legacy funding, the way it has looked at the last mile, but whereas a lot of the cost that we experience today, they are coming from video streaming, which may actually impact the middle mile more, and that's not really the area that is necessarily adequately covered through USF. So it can be a challenge for rural providers to recover those costs. And certainly in all cases, when we talk about underrepresented communities, Native American communities, and so forth, where the expertise about running networks isn't necessarily there. But what I would like to ask you, Brett, because you are a person who works with communities directly, and I would say, from the point of view of a company, if you care about your customers, you're going to serve small businesses, large businesses, households. You're going to be smarter if you pay attention to their needs, and of course, provide a service that they need. What would you say, in response to Ernesto, where he's talked about, what is a company doing to understand the needs of its community? And I think that's probably, the bread and butter of what you do every day.
Yeah, so I appreciate the question and the point that Ernesto put on the table. And I can speak to maybe the arc of how we've learned and grown around this. I was involved with, writing and then launching Internet Essentials 9 years ago. And for those who have been around, you can remember the early research and trying to claw space and having a conversation about adoption while we talk about the bright, shiny object of the networks. And over that time, I think we've learned that obviously you have a customer to service. That customer may have some unique needs here, and Internet Essentials was built to be, it's a product that has a program wrapped around it, right? And so we can take a broadband product and you can discount the price and sell that. And for some people for whom affordability is the single barrier, that may do it. But I think what we've learned over time, and we're still learning it now during COVID, is that got a long list of other challenges that people have that many folks don't really appreciate or understand. And there are ways to get at that that are non-traditional for what anyone would think about when you're doing outreach and doing marketing. But barriers, like we've known for 9 years, and we know today that language is a barrier. And so you often have to meet people where they are and in their language. And if you can't, then you won't necessarily be able to sign them up. And that's why for us, the partnerships means everything. That, doing air cover, blasting, advertising, in the end, for a lot of this isn't what matters most. It's about the people in the community who are the ones who are bringing people, to the table. Literacy, a significant issue. If you can't read, the idea of signing up is not something you do necessarily on your own, even when you're at a moment like this where it is important. And we're seeing examples of that in places around the country. The undocumented. We have a significant challenge with making sure that people who are undocumented feel comfortable, they have a need. We had to change and expand the number of ID. We have over 14 forms of identification that we allow to allow people who are undocumented to feel comfortable and to sign up. And so there is real work in figuring out the programmatic element of that, but we've known this for 9 years. And I'll say one other thing, because I think we touched on it a little bit. Oftentimes we'll get together a bunch of people who work in the tech space, and we make this a tech conversation. So it'll be, the ISPs and, the tech companies. But, if we needed a reminder, we got a reminder during COVID that this is everybody's concern and everybody's issue. So I'm a former healthcare person. 20 years ago, I was doing telemedicine with dial-up service, congestive heart failure patients, home healthcare visits, doing pulse ox, blood pressure, the whole shooting match 20 years ago. We proved the efficacy of that. The system hadn't evolved because we didn't focus on how do we now take what we know is something we're going to need and actually make it work from a simple technology consumer perspective. And so I think, this moment in time is a time to reflect, but then also bear down on whether it's education, healthcare, and all kinds of healthcare or employment. You've got to, see that what we do has a lot of inputs and outputs. And one other thing I would just, mention on this is, we are, we're fortunate in a lot of cases here where we've come at this from different places. So in markets where we serve, we obviously have a HFC hybrid fiber coaxial solution. We compete against people who have fiber. We've got gig speeds across our entire footprint. Everyone is pushing to get to more gigs. We have to see that this is an ever expanding horizon on the technology side of it, and have to see that alongside of, you got to bring people along while they're doing it. And that work is actually hard work. So the thing that I think I'm most proud about in what we do, while imperfect, is that The programmatic side of this, the people who are doing the hard work programmatically are the ones that are making sure that as we, innovate and move quickly, that you don't leave people behind because, either they didn't know how to sign up for it or they couldn't use it in a way that was helpful to them.
So, well, thank you for that, Brett. I think it's very insightful. I'm going to note our time at 1/4 and as I understand, Silicon Flatiron has a rule that the students are first in terms of getting to ask questions. We have 15 minutes left scheduled in this particular program. We also have the breakout rooms after. I am noting a number of people in the Boulder area have submitted very interesting questions in the Q&A section. I still have questions for the panelists, but I also want to give a chance for the students to weigh in because they are the reason that the school exists. So Amy, will you please give us our student question?
Thank you, Rosalind. We'll turn it over to Richard Cott.
Hi, can you hear me okay? Great. Well, first, thank you all for participating in the panel today. Excuse me. I think I speak on behalf of all the students who are watching that this was extremely informative and valuable to us, so thank you for sharing your time. I want to ask a question, though, about a subject that wasn't explicitly discussed today, but I think it lingers in the background and bears addressing at least briefly, even if it's Noah's area of expertise. Excuse me. And that is, to what extent do geopolitical considerations motivate our efforts to expand broadband access domestically, right? Obviously, a digital divide creates a number of issues for our country internally to deal with, as we discussed, but it also puts us at a competitive disadvantage in the international economy, specifically, compared to countries like China, who don't have the same gaps in infrastructure that we do. So how do these geopolitical realities factor into your thinking and influence the way that you frame the issue, if at all, that is? Thank you.
Well, so I'm going to take a stab at it.
Okay.
Ernesto, please. I wasn't. Please, you start. Let
me just jump in. So I in a past life I worked on the Energy and Commerce Committee for a rural member from the Midwest, and you're absolutely right. There are lots of different geopolitical, where you live, and it's not even by partisan basis. It's really just like where in the United States you live is kind of paints your worldview about where we are and access and whether we're doing a good job or not. And I would say there's a lot of tension and a mutual agreement between kind of representation from urban centers and rural markets, and then there's a lot of kind of in between that too. And the answer, I think, from an advocacy perspective is serve everyone, right, and without exception, and serve everyone with equal access to the same high quality connectivity, and that is how you kind of get everyone together. The real divisions I run into often from an advocacy standpoint is the industry. Every part of the industry has a different perspective of what the future should hold, and lobby very aggressively to preserve their space in the outcomes here. And it is the job of policy and policymakers in government to set the goals and take everyone into account. But the answer to those tensions is simply just you all benefit as much as all of my community benefits, and the goal should be to serve everyone.
I mean, I'm happy to jump in as well, Rosalind.
Please go ahead, and then I'm going to turn to Greg. Yeah.
No, and I apologize, Greg, if you had your hand up. So I mean, I think that's right. I mean, as we've looked at this, differentiating between the deployment issue and the adoption issue, two different things, and we know that the deployment issue is targeted. And that it is not anywhere near as big of an issue as the adoption issue, but it is a significant challenge. And I think from a policy perspective that we'd all look at it and say that everybody should have access to broadband networks. I think in the, what do they look like? Even, I think the point in China solves their deployment in a very different way than we could or do. And in the US, we're going to have different ways that we solve for those challenges, and having the flexibility, as long as we say, this is what we are looking for, then we ought to have the ability to solve it in more than one way. But I think it's turned out that we have differences, but the goal for everyone is to make sure that people are able to, participate in the 21st century economy with access to broadband networks.
I want to sort of address the question and then turn it to a somewhat of a disagreement with Ernesto. So I'm warning you, Ernesto, ahead of time. This is, the geopolitical thing. One of the factors, sort of, I think, hurting rural adoption of a specific technology is geopolitical, which is, and I don't know if I'm not nearly technical enough to know if it will work or not, but LEO satellites that circle the globe need international cooperation in order to have a large enough market to use the, to cover the costs, the fixed costs of doing this. But if they are good, this could really bring coverage to everybody quickly. And it could, the cost structure as an economist of a satellite system is, once it's up in the air, it doesn't matter whether you're in a corner of Northeast Montana or Southern Arizona or anywhere, you have access. Now, the question is, right now, I think that geostationary satellites advertise 25.3 service or better, but it seems like it's not a great solution, both because of the speeds and latency and data caps. If satellite service can serve subject to constraints, again, about data caps or other things like that, this is something that we might not need to, it might not be a good financial, I teach cost benefit analysis. It might not be cost beneficial to string fiber to the last 1% of households in rural areas, and instead spend that money to help low-income families get online and to provide the other things that may be more socially beneficial than increasing the speed to fiber and future-proofing, as you put it. It may not be the right answer to, as I always say, Ted Kaczynski's cabin. We don't necessarily want to try and bring fiber to every isolated cabin in the United States, because it will be extremely expensive, and that money can probably be better spent elsewhere, but still guarantee access through something like a LEO satellite, if that works.
So I want to, Ed JL, I'm sure you have something, you probably think about this in many ways. So what I'm sure you have a view here.
Well, we actually get in a variety of conversations about bridging the divide in rural and tribal areas. This question of the promise of LEO satellites comes up quite often. And right now it's still theory. The networks are not up and running, so that will determine, we still have to determine how they perform when they're fully operational, and how much the service will actually cost. Because this is, launching a satellite is quite expensive as well. So the uncertainty of that is still to be seen. It's still a satellite connection, which means it requires latency. And somebody in the questions, a commenter in the question said that even with existing networks in Boulder, Colorado right now, the Boulder School District is finding that the data and bandwidth needs that their students need is not there. Right, so to put our bets on a yet to be proven, yet to be seen how it performs solution to connect rural communities is quite, it doesn't feel quite right. I also think that, there will always be, the last community that remains to be connected, and it will not be cost effective to connect it with fiber. It will be pretty expensive, but are we sacrificing then, leaving certain people out of the ability to connect with the bandwidth that they need, with the connectivity that they need to truly participate in our society? Is that the trade-off that we're making, right? And I work with the communities that are always on the wrong side of that equation. Remote rural areas do not present the profit options that densely populated urban communities represent. So if the question is, oh, it's not really cost effective for us to include them, then I guess, you know, we start thinking more about, like, what does that mean for us as a nation to choose to leave certain communities behind because it doesn't make economic sense? What are we losing? What are the contributions of rural tribal communities that we're losing because they don't have the connectivity and the infrastructure that they need to be able to actually contribute their knowledge to our nation and help us become more competitive in a global market?
So if I can add to that too, you know, one of the things that I thought was really fun to hear from a rural cooperative, and you know, and I'll say, like, if the problem we had was just the fraction of the 1% left to wrap up with, we would not be having this panel, right? Like, that's not the problem, right? The problem is a lot more systemic and a lot more, we're talking, you know, California's got 1.2 million students but don't have access to sufficient internet to do remote education, right? We're not talking about the fraction of 1% left. But even if we were, you know, I've got, you know, cooperatives came into existence because of this. You know, if you can get an electricity line to that household, you could probably get a fiber line. I mean, that's essentially how they see it. And you know, expensive and profitable, you know, we have to remember there's a public model structure too, right? It's not just the private models that will solve these problems. There has to be an embrace of strong local public models. And you know, you've got you know, probably the most impressive, difficult to serve build I've seen so far was in Missouri. It's about 2.5 people per square mile with fiber at $100 per month for an account, and it's sustainable, right? And so going lower in the density margin to that fraction of 1%, I agree. You know, I think that you'll keep running into that challenge. But at the same time, if we were able to figure out electricity to those folks, you know, I don't disagree with the underlying notion that we can figure this out. It just won't be a profit driven solution. It'll be a long-term public sector effort you'll likely has to be run by the local community. And where government policy becomes really important here is assisting them with you know, I say likely figuring out how to get access to the backhaul, right? If that remote, they have to figure out where they're connecting to actually get access to the greater internet. And you know, maybe the solutions like SpaceX can be useful in providing them that remote backhaul connectivity to those areas. The last point I would point out is, even though satellites are going to need a fiber line somewhere at the end of the chain, and so you know, we don't have to think about purely from a fiber to the home and fiber to each household connection, but we do need to have, you know, the infrastructure, the roads of the internet further and deeper in more places and accessible, not just for the public sector, but definitely for many of the different private uses, not just for LEO, but also to leverage all of the spectrum for the FCC. You know, I think one of the best things that the FCC has done is open up a lot more spectrum for a lot more users to simply buy hardware off the shelf and offer a lot of new unlicensed uses in the coming years.
So, well, we are coming, unfortunately, to the end of our time. I think we could probably spend a whole other session on international aspects. And I want to say thank you to Rich for such a great question. And I want to leave one data point with the audience. The U.S. is investing about 1/4 of the world's total private investment in broadband, which is a staggering number, and it's quite significant. And there is certainly a global competition. We are now going to turn back to Silicon Flatirons, go to our breakout rooms. I want to thank all of the panelists who've done a beautiful job. The questions, there's certainly many more questions, and it looks like we'll have opportunity to dig more into those, and audience members can go to the areas, to the breakout rooms where they'll be focusing on that. Thank you, panel, for a great job.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much, Revlin, and thanks everybody. That was incredibly fantastic. I want to invite you now all to our AirMeet networking session. You've heard about this for the last hour and a half, so I know you're prepared. Once you get there, you'll click Cable. It will join you to the other speakers at that table. You can move around to any table you want to be at based on who you want to talk to. It will take a couple seconds to register, but we're excited to see you all and provide a real, almost in person, but not quite networking experience for you. Please copy the link from the chat here in Zoom before you leave Zoom, and then exit completely out of Zoom to join AirMeet, so you're not competing for a camera and microphone access in the AirMeet platform. It works best on Chrome browsers, but you can try it, and it works for me on a different browser. And we really, really look forward to seeing you all. Thanks to CableLabs and to Rob for helping us co-host this, and a huge thank you to all of our speakers, including our keynote, for being here with us today. Have a lovely afternoon, and I hope to see you shortly.